In this lesson, we're going to discuss the transformation tools. If you'd like to follow along, go under the File menu to Open. And in the Sample Files folder, select 0404 Transformation Tips and Tricks and just click Open. What is transforming? Well, it's selecting an object and in some way changing it, like for instance, scaling it, rotating it, even something called skewing or shearing it. We'll talk about all of those different kinds of transformations. We're going to start with something called the Free Transform tool. If you can't find your Free Transform tool because it's hidden under some other tool, just hit your E key on your keyboard and it will come right to the top and get selected. Let me go over the top of an object and just click to select it. The Free Transform tool, it's one tool that does a lot of different transformations. Like for instance, if I go over the top of a bounding box point, I can click and drag to resize that object. Let me undo that, Command-Z, Control-Z. If I wanted to keep that transformation in proportion, I could simply constrain it by holding down my Shift key. And you can see it's keeping it in proportion. Let me undo that. The Free Transform tool also will rotate an object. You can see I have a little rotation icon outside of my object. So as soon as I'm outside of a bounding box, it becomes rotate, and I can click and drag it, and I can actually tell what the rotation is. So it's one transformation tool that does a lot of things. But to do more than scaling or rotate, you actually have to know some key commands. I'd rather actually use the Scale tool, the Rotate tool, and the Shear tool rather than using those key commands. Let me go back over the tool and just double click. That's the other thing I don't like about the Free Transform tool. If I double click on it, nothing happens. With the other transformation tools, I actually get a dialog box to put in exact specifications. Why don't we click down on the Free Transform tool and go to the Scale tool, and you'll see what I mean. To scale an object to any point in that object, all I have to do is go to the reference point proxy, which we've talked about in a previous lesson, and click on the point that represents a point in the bounding box of the object or the center. So if I wanted to scale this particular object to its lower right, I could click on that lower right reference point and then double click on the Scale tool. And you can see it's actually picking up the last settings I used for scale. Let me change the scale amount. I'm going to go to 90%. If you're not seeing anything happen when you change the scale amount, make sure to check preview or nothing will be shown on your screen. But you'll also notice that when I change the scale in the X field, how about 80%? If I click in the other field, it's going to keep the X and the Y scale percentage the same because they're actually linked together. If I wanted to scale out of proportion, I would have to unclick that. So it's now a broken link. And maybe I don't want to scale horizontally, so I'll make that 100% and then click in my other field to apply it. So you can scale out of proportion if you want to. I'm just going to re-click on that link and you see it's back to proportion. In all of the transform dialog boxes, you have three choices. You can click OK to apply your transformation. You can hit Cancel to get out of the dialog box, or Copy. Let me change the scale just a little bit. How about 75%? Click in the Y field to make them consistent. And then if I hit Copy, watch what happens. It makes a copy of the object, and that copy is scaled to 75%. But the original object hasn't been changed. Let me hit Delete to get rid of the object. And reselect my object and go to my Rotate tool. You'll see that it works exactly the same way. I can pick a reference point. Maybe I want it to scale to the center, and you can see the little crosshairs now moved. And I can double click on my rotate tool, and it's going to open a dialog box. And I can change the percentage. How about 35 degrees? It's not going to do anything until I hit preview. And you can see it's rotating 35 degrees around the center. And I have a choice of OK, cancel, or copy. I'm going to hit copy, and you can see the original has been left alone, and a copy, which is still selected, has been rotated 35 degrees. Look at the reference point. That has been rotated as well. So if I wanted to now rotate around a different point, I know which point in the reference point represents which point in the bounding box of the object, and you can see the crosshairs have moved to that top point. Let me just delete this object. There is another way to use your transform tools. You can actually use them manually. I'm in my rotate tool, and I'm going to click on an object, and you can see there's my reference point. And if I wanted to rotate around that point, all I have to do is click and drag. I'm not crazy about doing things manually, and that's because usually if I want to rotate something or scale something or shear it, I'll have an exact specification in mind. One of the things I can do, if I didn't want to use my reference point up here in the control panel, and this is true of all of the transform tools, I can actually go over any point and hold down my Option or Alt key on a PC and then click. And you can see that it's picking up those last settings, but it also opened the dialog box automatically. So by holding down my Option or Alt key and then clicking, I am selecting a reference point and opening the dialog box at the same time. So that's kind of a nice way to work. And I once again could hit OK, cancel, or copy. Let me hit cancel. The last transform tool that we're going to talk about, if you click down on your rotate tool and go to shear, what shear is, well, let me just show you. I'm going to double click on my shear tool, and the axis that I want to shear along is horizontal. And I'm just going to hit preview to see what happens. And you can see my reference point is automatically selected because it was selected up in the control panel. And watch what happens when I start increasing the shear angle. I have that field selected, and I'm going to hit my up arrow, and look what happens. It's making it into a parallelogram. It's actually slanting it over from this point 33 degrees. And if I were to do that vertically, it's totally different. Watch what happens. It's shearing it up from this point 33 degrees. It's a way of transforming an object that actually distorts the object. It almost looks like it's going back in space. Almost like this is a cover that is folding up from where it originally was. And once again, I have a choice of OK, cancel, or copy. And don't forget, if preview is not checked, you're not going to see the transformation. I'm just going to click cancel to undo that. There are a lot of transformations that you can do in the control panel, including changing the width and the height. You can change the scale. You can see that scale is actually linked together to keep it proportional by default. Another thing that I can do is pick a reference point. You can see there's my reference point right there in the object. And if I start clicking my up arrow next to rotate, look what happens. One point at a time, it is rotating the object around whatever point I selected in my reference point. Let me go back to 0. There's a pop-up menu. I can just select from a whole variety of rotations. There's also a shear field, and watch what happens if I click the up arrow next to shear. It is shearing from that lower right point in my object, because that's the point I have selected in my reference point. Some other things I can do. Let me unshear this. Go back to 0. I can rotate an object. How about I select a different object? I'm just going to go to my selection tool and select this watermelon. And I'm going to rotate the watermelon 90 degrees clockwise. And you can see it rotated it around the reference point that was selected. Let me rotate it back. So you can rotate clockwise or counterclockwise 90 degrees. Another thing I can do is actually flip the object horizontally or vertically. And it's doing it around that selected reference point. Let me go back. I'm going to do this and this. And I'm back to where I started. But I want to show you something else. Let me select the center reference point and flip this horizontally. Is there any way to tell that that has actually been flipped? Well, with this photograph, no. But if I look in my control panel, you can see this P. And the P is not only backwards, it's outlined. Anytime you see that P outlined, it means that the object has been flipped. Why am I making a big deal about this? Well, if there happens to be text in a particular photograph and you flip it, and then it's part of a brochure that gets printed, afterwards, somebody's going to see that that text is actually flipped, and that's not a good thing. So pay attention to this P. The P will show you any transformation. Let me show you. I'm going to unflip it. And now I'm going to rotate it and watch what happens with the P. The P is actually rotating. Let me shear it. And you can see that the P is actually shearing. You can see any transformation that has been done to a particular object just by selecting the object and then looking at the P to see if it looks in the least bit unusual. I'm going to go under the Options menu of the Control panel to go to Clear Transformations. And anything that I've done to this object in terms of transformations will now go away. And you can see my P is back to normal. We're going to continue discussing working with objects in the next lesson.